Okay. All right, so good evening, everybody. My name is Caitlin Lynch, and I'm an AmeriCorps member with Nevada Department of Wildlife. And with me is Jess Wolf, and she is our Urban Wildlife Coordinator for Nevada Department of Wildlife. And she is going to be helping me out with any questions that anyone might have and just making sure everything goes smoothly. So before we get started, just a few ground rules. So this is going to be a family program, so please make sure that you are being appropriate in the chat and the Q&A. And all questions, just make sure you are putting them in the Q&A and not the chat box. There are two different ones. We will have the chat open for open-ended questions. So I will be asking a number of questions throughout the program. And if you would like to participate, there is an option to join the chat and share your thoughts. So that will be what the chat box is for. But anyways, failing to follow these guidelines will result in being muted in the chat or possibly removed. So please make sure that you are behaving appropriately during this time. And okay. So today's program is on Nevada's natural history. So we have a very rich natural history here in Nevada, and I'm very excited to share with you some of the different things that we've discovered over the years through fossil evidence and just, what we've discovered from our own biological studies about the state and the rich flora and fauna that have lived here in past lives. So we have a few learning goals today. So today we're going to learn how to be able to identify evidence of change in Nevada. So kind of like where you can find these areas of change, I guess what kind of different species lived here and why, and I guess the change in ecosystems and environments and habitats as well. We're also going to compare and contrast the flora and fauna of today with the flora and fauna of past time periods. And also going to be able to understand how scientists trace evidence of flora and the fauna of the area. So making sure that we can understand, what techniques that we use to uncover these mysteries. We're also going to cover some definitions for today. So one of them is going to be flora. I talked about flora and fauna a bit just previously. So basically that's what we use to describe the plant life of a particular region or a time period. And also fauna, which is the animal life of a particular region or time period. Extinction event. So a lot of people have questions about what exactly is an extinction event, and it is technically considered a widespread rapid decrease of biodiversity. So a major loss of species and life within an area during a specific time. And paleontology, of course. So paleontology is the branch of science concerned with fossils. So it's a nice little combination of biology and history. We like to combine those and use some of our skills of investigation to determine what was here before. So we'll be focusing on some different timelines today. Obviously, time is pretty immense when we look at the Earth. We've been around for 4 billion years. So we kind of have to condense this into a very short program. We don't have a whole lot of time to talk about 4 billion years. So we're pretty much just going to be focusing on a much smaller portion of that. So we're going to be focusing on the Mesozoic era, which is going to include the periods for the Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous. And also the Cenozoic Tertiary, which technically includes the Paleogene and the Neogene. And then the Cenozoic Quaternary, which is the period that we're currently in. And we're mostly going to focus on the Pleistocene and talk a little bit about the Holocene as well. So that's going to be inside of this box here, where we're going to be able to kind of understand that. And I'll come back to this timetable periodically so we can understand where we're going. So Earth has changed quite a bit during this time, especially Nevada. Nevada was definitely quite an epicenter for change geologically as well as biologically. We had what we call Continental Drift, and this is a little bit of a basic Earth science lesson, but for anyone who needs a little bit refresher, we'll talk about that real quick. So with Continental Drift, we started in Pangaea in the Permian period, and during the Permian period, there was a lot of development of sea life, multicellular organisms. It wasn't very developed yet to where we are now, where we have reptiles, mammals, aquatic life. We were very simple at this time. And then as we kind of get into the Mesozoic, we get into this separation of two major continents. So that's where this is going. As we kind of drift apart, we're going to get a separation of continents. So it was theorized that we actually had this landmass called Pangea, and there's a lot of different fossil evidence to show that, and they separated from each other over time, and this happened through a couple different major events. And we won't really get too into that, but some of the ones that happened in Nevada we'll talk about. And there's a little cool interactive thing that I found that I also want to show everyone. So you can actually see what Earth used to look like millions of years ago. So let's go back about like 240 million years ago, which is where we're going to start off. So this is the United States right here. As you can see, we're part of the greater landmass of Eurasia. So this is kind of where we get that one major area where there was a lot of different animals and plants kind of sharing this great landmass, which is why when we separate onto continents, you will see that there are some animals that overlap in where they were originally from. And as we go down the list, let's say about 150 million years ago. So kind of getting more to where we are now, but obviously still a lot of drifting to do. But we'll come back to that later. And I want to see what everyone thinks. So what kind of plants and animals do you think lived in Nevada over millions of years? So go ahead and feel free to share in the chat what you believe might have been here millions of years ago. Oh, okay. For some reason, it's not letting me see the chat.
I can list some of those off. So we've got sea life, huge fish, ferns, ichthyosaurs, arthropods, giant sloths, fish, dinosaurs, mega lakes, mastodons, alligator or crocodile species, coral reefs, to name a few.
Perfect. Awesome. So yeah, definitely a lot of those are correct. You'll actually come to find out we definitely did have sloths, ichthyosaurs, some giant fish that lived in the area, mammoths. So people definitely mentioned quite a few of those. All right. So going, hold on. Is everything still okay? Sorry, it shows that it's crashing on my side with Zoom.
I do see a little box, but it looks like it came up.
Okay, cool. Never mind. Sorry, technical difficulties. Okay, so then we're going to talk about the Mesozoic era. So this is kind of where I'm going to start our rebuilding of our time frame, kind of looking back at our natural history. So it's going to be right in this box that we talked about, the Triassic, the Jurassic, and the Cretaceous, kind of known as the age of the dinosaurs. So this is going to be between 252 million years ago to 66 million years ago. And like I said, this is probably what the Earth would have looked like back then. So we get a little bit of separation between Eurasia, North America, separating from South America, Africa, Antarctica, and Australia as well. This is where that separation begins to start. And we have quite a few geological changes that are going to happen during this period. So we're a part of the continent Laurasia in the Triassic era, in the Triassic period, and then it's going to kind of slowly start to separate. The North American plate was thrusted westward, and this is going to create our Sierra Nevada range. And then by the Cretaceous period, Nevada was mostly underwater as a shallow seabed. So not until probably the start of the Cretaceous period do we get to see more of that Nevada actual land mass instead of just being underwater. And during this time, it was also a very tropical climate. So at this time, we can see a lot of swamps, jungle, and we'll go a little bit more into what we would see in different parts of the state. And pluvial lakes were also still covering much of northern Nevada, but that didn't really kind of get very serious until the Tertiary period during the Cenozoic. So we have Triassic flora and fauna during this time. So this is between 231 million years ago and 201 million years ago. And the biggest one, as you can guess, is the aquatic reptile, the ichthyosaur. And that lived in our shallow seas. And I'll also cover that a little bit more in a second. But almost all of Nevada during this time had aquatic plants and was mostly underwater. It was a shallow sea. And southern Nevada's most, I guess, reputable dinosaur was the phytosaur. And this can be comparable to an alligator. So it was a little bit larger than an alligator and had more of a robust joint. So it sat a little bit more plump. And it was mostly kind of going to be hanging out in swamps and was actually, feeding on some of the smaller animals that lived there at the time, mostly reptiles. And if you know anything about ammonites, so if you're, someone who goes and loves to collect fossils and different artifacts, ammonites were very widespread, but we had tons of them in Nevada. So they were a very large part of the shallow sea community. And ammonites were actually kind of like today's squids. So they had these very cool curly shells. And this is kind of a little bit of a fossil of what they would have looked like. So during this point in time, the ammonites would actually grow little segments of their shells, which is how we get this whole circle, circular look on the shell. And it's actually very interesting because this allowed them to flow and kind of move throughout their environment. The shell was actually filled with air and they would blow bubbles out to move around in their environment. And they were predated on by many different animals. They were definitely kind of a keystone species. We'll also talk a little bit about the ichthyosaur right now. So this is actually Nevada state fossil. And this fossil was found in Nevada and it was between 30 and 70 feet long. And it had these extremely large eyes to see through dark water. So when it was in the shallow seas, definitely areas where couldn't see very well. There were lots of caves. So it would go into caves, be able to use those very large eyes to see throughout the dark waters. And then it also had a long, thin skull with small razor-sharp teeth. And these were used for their very carnivorous attacks on smaller animals that would be in the water as well with them. And they're believed to be able to swim to 22 miles per hour. And to get a little bit more information about these ichthyosaurs, you can actually go to Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park, where within that area, they actually have hundreds of ichthyosaurs that they've been digging up throughout the years. So definitely an area where we found a lot of ichthyosaurs. And we actually have some of the largest ichthyosaurs in the world. Other places will get ichthyosaurs, but ours can be as large as school buses, where some other places they might have only been as large as dogs. So they weren't really that big in other places. So then we move on to the Jurassic period, which was between 201 million years ago to 145 million years ago. So the tough issue with the Jurassic period is that we don't really have a lot of fossil evidence for our animals during this period, and it's still being discovered in most of Nevada. So the biggest one that we know of during this time was the ichthyosaur. They were still occupying this region long into the Jurassic period, and they're probably the very predominant animal in the shallow seas of Nevada during this time. But we do know that this was one of the areas of time where we had the geological development of the Sierra Nevadas. So this is where we start to see that Western plate, the North American plate, kind of moving westward and pushing up to create the Sierra Nevadas. All right. So next we're moving on to the Cretaceous period. And there is some fossil evidence during this time to suggest that we had hadrosaurs and iguanodons roaming eastern Nevada. As we said, this is where the shallow seas kind of receded. We have that creation of the Sierra Nevadas, so obviously we will have more land animals and plants and whatnot. So hadrosaurs and iguanodons were both herbivorous dinosaurs during this time. So they were what we call the duck-billed dinosaurs. So you can see a picture of them in the background here. They had this very long forehead plate that ran backwards, and they also have a duck bill. And this kind of helped them to kind of get into tall trees, to kind of get rid of all of the herbs that they needed to eat and get berries. Various different flowering plants were around during this time. And also based off of the evidence of hadrosaurs and iguanodons, we can assume that we had Tyrannosaurus. They were a natural predator for hadrosaurs and iguanodons. And tyrannosaurs were actually found in some of the border areas around Nevada, so Utah, New Mexico. So we can definitely assume that they definitely crossed into Nevada to predate these hadrosaurs and iguanodons. And there was also an emergence of diverse groups of flowering plants at this point in time. So we had plenty of angiosperms and pines, so different things like that, but we didn't have many flowering plants. So this was definitely a big catalyst for getting a lot of different herbivorous animals in the area as well. Now we're going to cut into the Cenozoic area. So we've covered a little bit of time with the Mesozoic area, but with that, does anybody have any questions on what we just learned about with the dinosaurs?
Yeah, so we have one question. Why do duck-billed dinosaurs have those head plates? Do you know that?
So that's a great question. So actually with the head plates, it was kind of trifold. It was used to protect them in intra-specific competition. So that means between members of the same species. So often males would sometimes fight each other and they would ram their heads against each other and kind of push each other. So that's what we believed it could have been used for. Another thing was also to, they say that it could be used to kind of like run into trees to have fruit fall down or whatever. That kind of seems a little weird. I don't get why they don't just climb it, but that could definitely be possible use for that as well.
Awesome, okay. Thank you.
All right, perfect. Yeah, for some reason my my Zoom's being a little weird and won't let me look at the chat or look at the Q&A. So Jess, if you have any questions that anyone has, you can just feel free to shout them out to me, just because it's being a little difficult right now.
Perfect. Good. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. So we're going to move on to the Tertiary period, and this is going to be between the Neogene and the Paleogene, which is between 66 million years ago and roughly 5 million years ago. So it's going to cover this period right here. And one really major thing that kind of created this boundary between these two very important eras was the Cretaceous Paleogene Extinction Event. So we believed that the most agreed on theory during this time is that there was a major asteroid strike that created major climate change. So asteroid strike resulted in volcanic eruptions, major earthquakes, a completely huge and massive cloud of ash that covered the entire world. So during this time, we don't have a whole lot of warmth. It's definitely going to cool down significantly. And all large organisms over 55 pounds pretty much perished. So we only really get some aquatic ectotherms. So some of the larger aquatic mammals or reptiles, mostly, not really quite mammals, but mostly reptiles, we're going to stick around. But all of our dinosaurs died off. Any really large reptiles that were in the area also died off as well. So this is definitely important for creating a place for our birds and mammals to explode with diversity and change. And with that, we also had the large species leaving, so that left a huge open niche. So mammals were able to grow to really large sizes and begin to occupy those niches, and also the niches of some of the terrestrial reptiles that perished as well. And with the birds too, definitely pterodactyls were an issue for the birds in competition. So with pterodactyls and relatives of the pterodactyls being gone, there was a lot of room for our birds to also adapt and radiate significantly. And during this time, we also experienced a major change in floral landscape as well. So with those cold temperatures being a thing, probably the area was going to be significantly different. So we didn't have these very large blooming flowers. We didn't have these very large, leaves, because it was very hard to get sunlight. It wasn't easy to compete with all the different floral species in the area. So this is the first appearance of various species of sagebrush, not quite in Nevada, but they do start moving up into Nevada during this time. And northern Nevada was mostly covered in oak and redwood forests. And southern Nevada was going to be dry shrubland and grassland. So we can assume that this is probably what northern Nevada looked like during this time, and actually most of Nevada. So it kind of looked a little bit more like the Pacific Northwest. They were able to thrive with, minimal sun exposure and also a lot of cold weather and rain. So this is definitely going to be a point in time where the floral aspect of Nevada was very different from what we see today. And we also had a number of tertiary fauna as well. So this is where we get into some of the fun mammals that everyone talked about before. So we're going to have those lots of dinosaurs. We get these huge mammals. So some of the ones we get are going to be our horses, rhinoceros, ground sloths, tapirs, our large camels, and everything like that. So with that going on, we've got our large ground sloths, which actually grew up to about 7 feet in length. And they use their really powerful claws, actually, not to kill anything else, but really just to get up onto trees and take down whatever fruits they needed, get leaves that were high up in trees, and also to escape predators. We had our very large camels, and the way that the camels worked out, camels and horses, was that they actually began speciating over here in North America, and then several species of these larger camels and horses actually crossed the Bering Land Bridge, which is up between Alaska and Russia, during one of the ice ages and went over to the old world, so over to Asia, Europe, and Africa. So that's where we see those camels and horses today. And then probably right around the time of the Pleistocene, they actually died out. So a lot of the species that we see over here in North America, actually a lot of them were migrating to the old world. And when that Bering Land Bridge melted and everything kind of changed over here during the Pleistocene, they actually went extinct. So that's why we get some of these animals that were maybe here during the early Cenozoic era that aren't here anymore, and they're actually over in the old world now. So our camels during this time were up to about 7 feet tall in shoulder height, and they weighed over 1,000 pounds. So they were very significantly larger than today's camels. And they were also a little different. We believe that they only had maybe one hump and that the hump wasn't as large as today's camels. Some of them today have 2 humps or just one very large hump. So they were definitely very different. We had some of the different horses that we have here. So the cool thing about the horses that we had during this point in time was that we had some horses that were about the size of dogs. So they weren't very large. They didn't grow very big. Eventually they speciated and grew into these larger horses that look a little bit more like what we have today. But there was a point in time about 20 million years ago where they were actually grazing side by side. So you would see these smaller horses and these larger horses competing together for different areas and ranges, but they generally had about a similar diet. And an additional mammal that we had was also the tapir. This is a tapir skull up here. And the tapirs were kind of interesting because they're one of the few mammals of this time that pretty much didn't change by much. They only maybe grew a little bit in size. They were actually very small during this time. We also had some additional rhinoceroses that I talked about. So we had 2 different species of rhinoceroses that lived over here. And contrary to popular belief, we didn't have any woolly rhinoceroses. Those were going to be mostly in northern Canada and Mongolia. But we had some different swamp ones that hung out in swamps and some that hung out on open grasslands. So we had 2 different species of rhinoceroses during this time. And they also died out at the end of the tertiary. So now we'll get into the Quaternary Period, which is going to be between 2.6 million years ago to today. And this is going to include the Pleistocene and the Holocene epochs. So Pleistocene Nevada was going to be between 2.5 million years ago and 11,700 years ago. So we're going to be focusing on this point in time right here that's boxed over. Oh, and before I move on, did anyone have any questions about our tertiary period?
This isn't specific to that period, but the question is, when you say Nevada, does it include the entire Great Basin?
Yeah, so it's going to include most of the Great Basin. I know that the Great Basin spreads over to Utah and a little bit into Idaho as well during this point in time. So when I'm basing a lot of what we have found in fossil evidence, I'm also kind of going off of what we have found in the surrounding states that we can assume would have been here. So when we talk about the Great Basin, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of how the Great Basin was formed and also what was here during that point in time. So that's perfectly right now is what we're going to be talking about the Great Basin a little bit more.
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Awesome. So yeah, as I said, Great Basin definitely was a part of these pluvial lakes. So the pluvial lakes were from glacial builds and recessions, and this covered most of northern Nevada. So as you can see, we've got these lakes right here. So the two major lakes that we had during this time was Lake Lahontan and Lake Bonneville, and they left a few remnant lakes that we have today. So we have Pyramid, Lahontan, Walker, Tahoe, Carson. Those are some of the ones in northern Nevada that we have. Over in Utah, the Great Salt Lake is the largest remnant lake from Lake Bonneville. But this resulted in a very interesting climate. So when we say pluvial, it's going to be cold and wet. So it was a very cold and wet climate during this time. And of course, with the ice age coming in and out, we also had some areas where these lakes were going to be frozen part of the time. But at its largest, it was going to look a little bit like this picture right here. And there were a couple different Pleistocene habitats at the time. So we definitely did have a very strict separation between northern Nevada's habitats and southern Nevada's habitats. So during this time, northern Nevada would have been covered with mostly spruce and pine forests across its mountainous regions, especially since during this time, most of the valleys were going to be filled in with lakes. So our water was going to be filling in that area. So if you've ever been up to Tahoe, you know, or around the Sierra Nevadas and seen that environment, that's probably what you can imagine covering most of Nevada during this time. And then down in the south, we also have pinyon juniper forests, which are going to be filling up southern Nevada. And that's kind of similar to what you see now in the Great Basin. So we see a general trend with the climate change during this time. So as it got cooler, you know, it would move down a little bit. And as it got warmer, we can expect those habitats to move, you know, up. So they're going to move up in elevation. So during this time, the juniper forests were going to be slowly moving up to northern Nevada as everything kind of warmed a little bit. And also the boundaries of these would change. And like I talked about, those glacial changes were very important in changing the boundaries. And as you can imagine, with these crazy floral and habitat changes, this was definitely putting a lot of pressure on the animals of this time. So this required the different fauna of the area to have a lot of specializations and adaptations to deal with the changing climate. And this is kind of a little bit of a picture of what you can imagine it might have looked like in northern Nevada and then also in southern Nevada. With that being said, we'll talk a little bit about our Pleistocene animals. So this is kind of my favorite part because everyone gets very excited about some of the large mammals that we had here at the time. So one of the ones we have is the North American cheetah, and it's going to be down here a little bit. You can kind of see this. And this is actually a mural from the College of Eastern Utah, which I thought was very interesting. So they had a very similar habitat during that time, and it looked very, very closely related to what Nevada would have looked like at this time. So our North American cheetah was pretty similar to the cheetah we see today over in Africa. It was slightly larger. It originated here and actually went back over to the Old World before the end of the Ice Age. So that's why we see the cheetah over in the Old World more so than it is here. We will see some speciations of the North American cheetah, but not really. So it might have speciated into our modern day bobcat species and some similar puma concolor. So that's going to be our mountain lion. But the North American cheetah was very fast and it would often chase some of our ungulate species. So antelope during this time would coexist with the American cheetah and also some different types of deer at the time. Another really cool one that we had was our cave bears. And cave bears could stand about 10 to 12 feet tall, which is pretty crazy. And they had a domed skull. They looked a lot more like the modern brown bear of North America. So if anyone's ever seen a brown bear, just imagine it slightly bigger with more of a domed skull. And cave bears actually struggled a lot during the Pleistocene. And this is mostly because They had a hard time adjusting to the change in temperatures. They had a very omnivorous diet, but mostly we're going to be gathering berries, insects, different plants and whatnot. And with the, glacial changes, it made it hard for them to keep track of their food, and also brought periods of food instability for them. So it was very hard for them to adjust to these changes. Also saber-toothed cats. So saber-toothed cats often competed with the cheetahs. They were found throughout Nevada. So a lot of these were going to be in southern Nevada, is where we found some of our saber-toothed cat fossils, right in the Valley of Fire. And saber-toothed cats had these very long incisors and canines as well. So the canines were going to be up to, I think, 10 to 12 inches long, so almost like a foot long. And these were more used as a defense against other males. It wasn't really having to do as much with eating per se. It would definitely be a help in hunting their prey. So that was a big help for them adaptationally. We have our mammoths as well. So our mammoths stood between 10 and 12 feet at shoulder length, and they weighed over 6 tons. So they were very large. And we have our woolly mammoths, which is a little different. So we have several species of mammoths. The one that lived up here was woolly, so it was covered in very thick hair so that it could survive the changes in the glacial temperatures and the glacial recessions and builds. And then lastly, we have our ancient condor, which is up here in the sky. So our ancient condors were actually about an extra foot longer in wingspan than our current California condor. So it was definitely going to be a monster of the skies during this time. And it would often eat, kind of medium-sized mammals like, smaller tapirs or foxes or cats, whatever was around during this time. And not to mention, it would also prey on different reptiles or fish, whatever was around. So then we get this transition into the Holocene, which is the Ice Age. So we all know and love the Ice Age series by DreamWorks, but it's actually very inaccurate for the Ice Age. So that one tends to talk about dinosaurs and all this other stuff. There was no existence of dinosaurs at this point in time. So the late Pleistocene was going to be experiencing major fluctuations of extreme cold and glacier builds and recessions, and it resulted in massive migrations. So a lot of animals were going to be going to and from the old world from the new world. And this is where we also get the appearance of our modern humans kind of coming over to North America. They used the Bering Land Bridge to get over here and also to follow different species that might have come over here. And the most recent extreme ice age event was going to be, so it was 12,000 years ago, and this was just before the Holocene boundary. And the state as a whole kind of fluctuated between cool wetlands and temperate forests, just depending on the boundary was always changing. And this is a pretty good visual that I like to use for talking about the ice age. So right around here, the Wisconsin Glacial Period, we get our last ice age. So I said that was 12,000 years ago. And from here, it just gets warmer. So 12,000 years ago, roughly when we start our Holocene. And with the end of the Ice Age brought more evidence of our early humans in Nevada. So this is a picture from Pyramid Lake up in northern Nevada, just north of Reno. This is some of the oldest petroglyphs that we have in the United States. So these date back to about 14,000 years ago, which is interesting to be a state with the oldest petroglyphs as well as the oldest evidence of humans. So it's really exciting. And that's the evidence that suggests they were here roughly 14,000 years ago. So that's when we can date these back to. And there's also about 20 or so stone tool sites that exist across Nevada, which kind of puts them at the same point in time as the animals of their time, so the Pleistocene. We don't really have any major evidence that they were using these animals as tools, but we do know that they probably coexisted with a lot of these different animals and probably very much hunted them or were predated by them as well. But this is very important to know that because we want to make sure that we can understand how they played a part in the food chain and I guess what their influence was on the different populations of various species that lived here during the time. And then ancient humans are also important because we want to make sure that we can understand maybe if they had any effect on extinctions or if they had any effect on why the animals were moving. So we kind of have to do a little bit more research on that, but there's lots of different discoveries that we have here in Nevada. So there's a number of ways that scientists actually gather this data. Number one, very obviously, is fossils. And when we say fossils, we're mostly dating the soil in which a fossil is found, which is carbon dating. So this is going to be using stratigraphy, which I'll talk about in a second. We also use Palinology, which is the study of pollen. So it's going to be using pollen that we find in different various areas. So, trapped in soil, it could be fossilized, whatever. We also use comparative fossil study. So this might be, looking at fossils from a certain time frame and understanding, well, this fossil looks very similar to this one. So can we assume that these were in the same time frame, or these have very similar adaptations to this one. So were they dealing with the same kind of temperatures? Were they dealing with the same kind of availability of resources? So we always have to think of that as well. And then, as I said before, the stratigraphy. So it's going to be a soil profile. And it's kind of interesting because when we talk about soil profiles, you can actually dig down far enough. Sometimes if you're wandering around Nevada, you might see some exposed areas where you can see a soil profile. So there might be some areas where a very significant amount of rock is cut out and you can actually see the layers. So analyzing that is kind of how we get the different analysis of where those fossils might have been and kind of like the carbon dating aspect of things. And so this is kind of where I talk about the evolutionary pathways. So this, for example, is humans. This is Homo sapien. We are up here. And as you can see, we have not existed for very long compared to a lot of our other ancestors. But we do use this chart kind of to understand where we were and what we did, and I guess when we could have appeared. So Homo sapiens have a very, developed skull, and we have forward-facing eyes, and we do not have a robust jaw or anything like that. But then we go back in time and we have these less developed ancestors who do not have as much of a developed skull. They have very robust jaws for chewing things. They might have a different kind of dental structure. So we use those to determine, I guess, where that certain humans could have fallen in the time frame. And as I was talking about with stratigraphy, this is a pretty good example. This is the South Grass Valley project for Nevada exploration. And this is kind of just a really good tool that they would use to understand what kind of soil types you'd be finding these fossils in. What would they look like? What would their pH be? What would they be consisted of? So this is what they would use. And I'll just also kind of touch back on Palinology. So Palinology, the study of pollen. So these are some different types of pollen you would see. And they would study latrines, middens, and scats. And if you don't know what latrines or middens are, a lot of animals would use one area to, go to the bathroom. So they would have one area, and we could definitely go into there and look at what was there. We can dissect it, we can take out samples and kind of get an idea what their diet was. And so if we knew that they were eating certain seeds or certain plants, we can find evidence of those seeds or the pollen that they might have consumed during that time. And we also get fossilized pollen as well. So fossilized pollen is a little bit harder because it's very microscopic and is very easy to miss. So with my microscopic fossilized pollen, it takes a lot of very delicate retouching of the soil and fossils to really be able to understand it. And this is also important because knowing the flora of the time gives us clues about the fauna as well. So we're going to do a quick activity where we become the paleontologist. So you're going to be able to take a crack at being a biologist and a historian. So I'm going to present a picture or a scenario, and I want you to tell me either you can say what time frame you think it's from, or I guess what you would say, what animal it is or what plant it is. So let's see. So I'm still having a little bit of an issue. I'm solving a little bit of an issue viewing the chat. So this one's, you're hiking in Nevada and find a cool place to rest at. a piece of a cliff falls and uncovers a fossil, and what do you think it is, and what time period do you think it's from? So I accidentally just revealed the answer if you caught it, but if not, can anyone tell me what they believe it is?
My 6-year-old immediately said ammonite.
Yeah, definitely. So I accidentally revealed it a few times because I'm still having technical difficulties. So it's definitely an ammonite, and it's definitely from the Triassic period. So that was a pretty easy one to start off. So we'll go to the next one where I won't ruin it. So you are a paleontologist at a dig site that successfully uncovers and removes the skull in one piece. Based on the adaptations of this animal, what could it be?
We've got ichthyosaur.
So it sounds like everyone's saying ichthyosaur, definitely. So it is our ichthyosaur, and you can tell by those really large eyes, that long pointed skull, and the sharp teeth. That's definitely going to be our ichthyosaur. And you could say that it was from the Triassic or the Jurassic. Those are the two periods that it was from. Okay. So you uncover a slab of hardened clay on the edge of a dried up lake bed and see this indentation. What are you seeing, and how far back could this be dated?
You picked a tough one.
Oh, well, are we calm silent?
We've got Jurassic ? And then flower/seed pods.
So we do have flowering plants, and flowering plants occurred around the Cretaceous period. So this is where we get a lot of our herbivores that are popping up. We get our flowering plants. So we get a lot of plant diversification. And the biggest one during this time was going to be the asters. So Asteraceae family of plants. So that's our flowering plants, just like sunflowers, and there's a couple other ones like carnations. That's kind of some of the ones we get during this time. All right. So the next one, you and your paleontology team are exploring a cave entrance in southeast Nevada. You come across what looks like a 3-foot long footprint. Your team takes a sample of the rock and determine the date to be from the early Cretaceous. What animal could this be? So it's a pretty big footprint. So what thing with a large footprint was walking around during this time?
We've got 1 vote for the T-Rex.
Okay, so we got Tyrannosaurus. I'll let other people kind of weigh in if they want to.
We've got T-Rex, alligator, hadrosaur, T-Rex, a dinosaur.
All right, so we got a lot of T-Rex. It's definitely Tyrannosaurus Rex. They were going to be leaving these really big 3-foot long footprints. And this actually is from Utah. So I can't really say it would be from Nevada, but it is a footprint taken from Utah. So we can assume that it would have been pretty close to being around here. So yes, Tyrannosaurus. Very good for everybody who was guessing that. Okay, so everyone did such a great job. I guess that was the last one. I took out the last one on accident. So there are a lot of different resources for anyone who is curious to learn more. So my favorite would be Berlin Ichthyosaur State Park. So that's going to be in central Nevada. If anyone lives around that area or wants to take a day trip to go visit them, there's always a good opportunity to do that. So we have the Nat Geo Dinosaurs online resources. So it's a great way to learn more about dinosaurs. The Las Vegas Natural History Museum has a lot of wonderful and amazing exhibits on human and animal history. And then also I use Paleontology Portal, which is actually surprisingly an interesting resource to use. So paleoportal.org has interactive maps, and also you can figure out what lived during a certain time. And the American Natural History Museum. So they have lots of cool online resources and online classes during this time for families and kids to learn more. And as always, in our current pandemic, please make sure that you're reviewing the guidelines and restrictions of the museums and parks, or just save your trip for another time when we're not in this pandemic. So up to you, if you feel safe, go ahead. And let's see if I can actually access the Q&A. No, I still can't. Is there any other additional questions?
Yeah, so I have a few in the Q&A box that I wasn't able to get to. So if you're up for them, I'm going to do rapid fire at you.
Cool.
So the first question was, sorry if I missed this, were the lakes salt or fresh water or some of both? And this is referring to the beginning of the Pleistocene.
So they were going to be a little bit of a mix. So when we start getting that recession of the lake, so when we go to, for example, where we get the Great Salt Lake, that recession caused a great runoff of a significant amount of minerals. So that's how we get what we know as the Great Salt Lake. But most of Lake Wahonton could be assumed to be freshwater.
Perfect, thank you. So is the state or UNR interested in remnants of large animals whose skeletal remains are encrusted in minerals from alkaline lakes?
So that's a great question. I'm actually not sure. I know that we have different paleo teams. I know UNR has an archaeology team, or will they have grad students that might, do some various archaeology projects. I'm not sure if the state actually does anything. It's usually a privately kind of funded ordeal, or sometimes, you get the Las Vegas Museum of Natural History that might send people out to go look for different things. But that's a great question. I can actually get back to it if anyone has, if anyone wants more information. I'll leave my email in the chat at the very end if I can access it.
Yeah, I'll pull that up and I can throw it in there, but definitely I would reach out to schools because they're typically the ones who have the most interest in those sort of things. Were there buffalo in Nevada?
So yeah, actually there were possibly some buffalo in Nevada, but this would have been probably not quite in the Pleistocene. It probably would have been roughly about 1,000 years ago. So this was before a great hunting of buffalo happened during the 1700s and 1800s. And we actually had a lot more of these grazing animals kind of across most of the United States. So they would have been in the Great Plains, but also kind of made their way over to the Great Basin as well. So Montana, Idaho, Nevada could have been assumed to have buffalo during this time. Do I have a scientific name for the ancient condor? That's a great question. I can actually probably look that up real quick and see if I do have a scientific name for the ancient condor. If not, a good way to find out is that you can look up condor phylogeny, and usually you can be able to find out which ones traced back to this time period. But I can always answer that question in an email as well.
And I just threw your email into the chat for anyone who is interested.
Perfect, thank you. All right, is it worth checking out Berlin even while the museum is closed due to COVID? So actually, I'm not really sure. I think, yeah, that they are possibly closed due to COVID. But there is a lot of really interesting stuff in that state park. Even without the museum, they actually do have some interactive areas outside of it. So they have I don't know if it's open or if it's a part of the museum, but they have an enclosed excavation area, which is pretty cool. I feel like that would just be kind of open, but I'm not really sure. Definitely go and check out their website. I really want to go visit them. I haven't visited yet. And let's see, I think I have one more question at the very bottom.
You have a few more. So was our fauna very different from other parts of the US?
So actually, yeah, when I was looking into a lot of the different areas where we would have found some of these fauna, Nevada didn't really have as many dinosaurs as the rest of the United States. So for example, you get brachiosaurs, triceratops, a lot of more, I guess, herbivorous dinosaurs during this time were going to be more on the East Coast. And also up until the Cretaceous period, there was what we called the Western Interior Seaway, which ran through what we now know as the Great Plains. And that would have covered kind of like, I guess, like Kansas, Iowa, or yeah, Iowa, let's see, just a couple different areas over there. And so that could have definitely brought in a number of aquatic wildlife as well in those areas. But it was very interesting trying to find which animals were here, because some of the classic dinosaurs you think of actually weren't really so much in Nevada as much as they were in other parts of the United States.
Perfect, thank you. And then did you know when did bats first appear / evolve in Nevada / Utah / Great Basin region?
Ooh, that's a great question. I'm actually not quite sure. So bats Bats are kind of more of a New World animal. At least the ones that we have here mostly are going to be from Central and South America, the microbats. So we never had macrobats over here. So the bigger bats that you find in other parts of the world. But we've always had microbats as long as they've been here. So that's a great question. But I can always get back to anyone who wants to, I guess, follow up with that.
Perfect, thank you. And then we just have one more question, just going back to the condor ancient condor really quick. Were they different than today's California condor?
So they were slightly larger. They were about another extra foot in wingspan size, and they also were a little bit more aggressive, actually. So we can assume that they had a much more aggressive diet of larger animals than today's condors, which aren't going to really go for as big of animals. Some of these ancient condors even predated like Pleistocene dire wolves or even like tapirs or whole large fish, large reptiles, anything like that. So they would have been kind of going after a lot more than the condors of today, like the California condor.
Awesome, thank you. And then we do have one little comment in the chat. Berlin is open except the mine and the Icky House. The town site is cool to walk through as well. And then check out, I'm gonna murder the name of this town, but Ione, this town that's kind of near there. And then
okay.
Yeah. And then one more question. Is there any database showing where each fossil species has been found?
So I really wish there was. The best database that I was using was Paleo Portal. Paleo Portal has some really good access to different ranges of dinosaurs. So I would kind of go off of that. Also, there are some different articles that have been shared by some grad students. It's hard because I only had access to them by asking some of my grad friends to have access to them. So it's kind of how with academia, sometimes they want you to pay to have access to various, articles or peer-reviewed articles. So it was kind of hard for me to get that information. But there's lots of awesome books to check out as well. There are some books that, follow the natural history of Nevada, and also the paleontological history of Nevada as well. And I can link those for anyone who is curious about them in an email.
Perfect, thank you. I don't think we have any more open questions that we haven't answered yet. And I lied the first time, I didn't get the email in there, but I did just send it to everyone. So that is in the chat if you want to grab Caitlin's email for any follow-up questions or those resources that she has. I'm sure she'd be happy to share.
Perfect. Well, thank you everyone so much for joining me today. I had such a great time talking about natural history, and I hope everyone has a wonderful night. Oh, and also there is a questionnaire at the end if you could just take a few moments to fill it out so we can get a little bit of better feedback.